I am Michael McFall. We are all at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Anybody from the class of '85 here today? So you just were sitting in the Freeman Spogli Institute. I don't know if you knew that for your class panel. I was there. That was a great panel. FSI, as we call it around here, as everybody at Stanford knows, we have lots of acronyms, right? So FSI is the hub for nonpartisan, I'm emphasizing that word, interdisciplinary research, teaching, and policy impact on international studies. And we all have lots of hats, but we are all at FSI. And actually, 5 of the 8 centers that are FSI are represented in our panel today. And we're going to give you a taste of what it's like to hang out at FSI for the next 55 minutes. And we're going to cover a lot of territory: climate change, China, democracy, Afghanistan, and cyber, all in 55 minutes. But I want you to think about it as a taste. Like this is a taste of what we do at FSI. And I want to encourage you to think about getting more involved in FSI. Through COVID, we've gotten better at virtual events. We've gotten better at interacting with people beyond the campus. And we want you to be more involved with us, right? So if you like what you hear today, especially if it's your first time interacting with FSI, we hope it's not going to be the last time you interact with FSI. So with that pitch for FSI, let me tell you about our panelists quickly. We gave you bios because we wanted to save time for discussion, but we are going to cover all those topics, and like I said, with an all-star cast. To my far left, not politically, I don't think, is Marshall Burke, who's the Deputy Director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment at FSI. He's also an Associate Professor at Earth System Science and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute and CPER. He's going to cover climate today. Didi Kuo, to my left, is a Senior Research Scholar at CDDRL, Associate Director for Research at the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. She's going to cover democracy in 3 short questions, both here and at home. Both here, mostly here probably, and a little bit abroad. To my right is Ariana Schuyler Mastro, who is also a Center Fellow at FSI and at the Asia Pacific Research Center. She also serves as a U.S. Air Force Reserve officer as a strategic planner. She's covering China for us today. To her right is Asfandyar Mir, research scholar at CSAC, Center for International Security and Cooperation at FSI. By the way, Asfandyar is also teaching a class that used to be called back in most of your days Poli-Sci 35. Anybody take that? Oh, great, right. How Nations Deal with Each Other with Steve Krasner. Was anybody there in the fall of '81 with me? Well, that's the class he's teaching today. It's called something, it has another number, right?
It's called Introduction to International Relations.
There you go. And he's teaching that this fall for the Political Science Department. And to my far right, again, not politically, but just geographically, is Alex Stamos. Alex is the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory at the Cyber Policy Center at FSI. Prior to joining Stanford, Alex served as a chief security officer at Facebook, where he led the company's investigation into manipulation of the 2016 U.S. election, among actually many, many other things, but that's the short bio. He's going to cover cybersecurity and disinformation for us. By the way, 4 of the 6 of us, Marshall, Oriana, Asfandyar, and myself, are all proud Stanford alums.
Yeah.
And just so Didi and Alex knows, we love Emory and we love Berkeley.
Yeah. Go first.
I actually do. If I'm not cheering for Stanford, I'm cheering for Berkeley.
Oh, thank you.
All right, let's get started. So it's mid-term season here at Stanford. So let's get everybody's midterm grades for the Biden administration on your area of expertise. How would you assess Biden's foreign policy so far? We'll just go right down the line first. Marshall, we'll start with you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Good to be here. OK, so imagine my course has 2 assignments. It has a project proposal for a research project, and then it has the research project that you actually have to turn in at the end of the quarter, OK? So on Biden, so I'm talking about climate change, Biden's project proposal for climate change is great. I'd give it an A, maybe even an A+. If you're someone who cares about climate change, this administration is far and away the most active, the most committed to doing something about the climate threat, both domestically and abroad. So the project proposal looks great. How's the research going? What's he going to get in terms of his final grade? That is really up in the air. And so this was really about foreign policy, but what Biden is able to do on the foreign policy stage really depends on what he can get done at home. So he has committed the U.S., at least verbally, to large reductions in emissions, consistent with the Paris Agreement that the U.S. signed 6 years ago, and we're now back in. Whether he's able to meet those, those targets that he laid out, that he committed to, depends on what happens in Congress over the next few weeks. And right now, it's not looking great. And so while I give him an A on the initial part of the course, really all the points are on what he turns in for the research assignment. And right now, it's not looking good. Sadly.
All right, so thank you all for being here. I just have to say it's so nice to see all of you in person instead of locked up in my basement with my kids running around upstairs for the past 18 months. And the reason I bring up the pandemic is because there were probably times when you were sitting alone in your house thinking that democracy didn't seem to be doing so well in the United States. And we know that Joe Biden was elected in 2020 in a large part by people who supported him, and in some part by people who probably didn't agree with a single thing he wanted to accomplish, but felt like we needed a restoration of democratic norms and values after the presidency of Donald Trump. We know from different indicators by international organizations like Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit that on various indicators of democracy, the United States has been doing worse for the past 4 or 5 years. And if you care about things like political polarization and economic inequality, those have been on the decline, or they have been worsening for about 40 years. So Biden takes office with a mandate to sort of improve democracy, which is very difficult. The things that I would say he's done well are, first of all, he's put democracy reform at the top of his agenda. Of course, there are more urgent matters like fixing this whole pandemic problem, Build Back Better, infrastructure, climate. But in there is a bill, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, that passed the House actually under Trump, also passed the House under Joe Biden, but was blocked in the Senate. It was reworked as the Freedom to Vote Act. Joe Manchin signed on, came up for a vote this week and failed because not any Republican senators were signed on board with it. There is still another piece of legislation, H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is coming up for a vote next week that would aim to restore some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act that were overturned by the Supreme Court, so we'll see how that does. So I think Biden has been vocal about the need to improve democratic rights and access to the ballot, some first-order democratic concerns. He doesn't like election violence. He doesn't like the contestation of election results. That said, it's going to be very difficult and challenging to pursue a democracy reform agenda, given that it's been politicized. And I can stop there, but I would also grade him about, high on aspirations, but so far very little committed.
So what's the grade?
Oh my goodness, B minus?
B minus, okay, all right, good. We'll come back to that. And by the way, I'm the moderator, but I'm gonna be an active moderator and chime in when I want as a color commentator. I actually worked with the president for a while at the White House, so I'm gonna reserve that for the chair, but I'm not yet, no. Let's turn to China. Ariane.
So I would give the Biden administration a B. I'm a notoriously harsh grader. Don't ask me what I would have given the Trump administration. I love the idea that we're in a great power competition with China. I speak Chinese myself, spent a lot of time in China. I have tons of friends there. I really admire a lot of what they've accomplished, but as I say, I'm an American strategist, not a Chinese strategist. So my job is to make sure that we can do research that can help us protect U.S. interests and values and those of our allies and partners. So the Chinese have been in a competition with us since the 1990s, and it's really great that we finally recognized that in 2017. It's not because we were geniuses, it was because Xi Jinping was literally hitting us over the head with all of his rhetoric and all the stuff that he was doing, militarizing the South China Sea, making statements about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which included taking Taiwan by force. So I was happy to see the Biden administration continuing that competitive element. I also really like they are very focused on domestic resiliency. The heart of the competition is something that I know very little about, but is U.S. domestic politics, education, and many of the issues that others work on at FSI. The problem really comes in the implementation and not thinking more innovatively about how we go about things. This is a problem that we have never faced before. And so we have a lot of people who look to the Cold War era, other eras, and they say, this is exactly like how we had to deal with the Soviet Union. You know, the fact that China is rising and all of its trading partners are US allies and partners is something new. We're also in a completely new military environment. When the Soviet Union and the United States were both trying to project power around the world, China's smarter than that. And they say, have fun with that, United States. Go start your wars. You know, Afghanistan cost 10 Belt and Road Initiatives, which is China's main economic program to spread their influence around the world. And so I'm in favor of the domestic resiliency. Secretary Blinken wants to lead with diplomacy. I'm a military person, so I do think that's good, but let's be more innovative about how we do it. I can list, and I have from many of our friends in the administration, new international institutions I want to see to help constrain China in cyber, in the nuclear realm, and outer space. If you follow the news, they just tested a hypersonic glide vehicle that went around the whole world, something the United States can't even do at low Earth orbits, which means our missile defense can't take care of it. So unless we have new institutions and we have new partnerships, revitalizing allies and alliances, good, not good enough. Working just with democracies, picking a handful of countries that we like, and we say, well, at least we have Japan and Australia, and the UK, so we're good to go. The world's much bigger than that. And China has been leveraging that. They want to be the leader of the developing world. And I don't see a strategy for the developing world right now. And so I'd like to have a lot more innovation also in the military realm. We can't win and fight wars anymore in Asia. And I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A, but a lot of people don't realize that even though our military can be far superior to that of China's, given their geographic advantages, if we fight them at this point, we're probably going to lose. And that's a huge problem for stability and peace in the region.
That was a very generous B. We're going to come back to that. So everybody knows, I have 3 questions for everybody, and hopefully we'll have 20 minutes at the end. We have microphones on both sides, and you can ask about anything, not just what we're talking about here. Okay? And Asfanjar, I got off on poli-sci 35, but you're here to cover Afghanistan.
Sure.
What's the grade on Afghanistan?
Yeah, so you know, continuing where Oriana left off, I would give President Biden, his administration, an A- just on the statement of the challenge that U.S. foreign policy faces, the fact that this era of forever wars has gone on for too long, and that the United States needs to pivot towards strategic competition. Give him an A- on that. I deduct that, you know, that small piece from the grade for some of the reasons that Oriana outlined. But then on Afghanistan itself, I gave him a failing grade. I think failing grade. That's right. I think
we don't give those at Stanford. Do we?
We don't. That's exactly right. And so I think that sort of goes to that should illustrate how disappointed I am with the outcome that we've seen in Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan in July. I came back extremely worried and concerned, and my worst fears were realized. 3 weeks later, when the government of Afghanistan collapsed and the Taliban returned to power and restored exactly the kind of government that they had before 9/11. There are major strategic implications of the return of the Taliban for the United States. For one, terror threats are going up steadily but surely. Al-Qaeda, the group that attacked the United States on the eve of 9/11, to this day remains aligned, allied with the Taliban. The Taliban remain committed to protecting them, and I think we're seeing assessments that the United States can be attacked once again in the next 12 to 24 months, and I think those assessments have a lot of merit to them. The other strategic consequence of U.S. withdrawal, or at least the way the U.S. has withdrawn from Afghanistan, is that allies are questioning U.S. commitment and resolve. Probably unfair in certain respects, but there's a lot of nervousness in places like Taiwan, and Oriana can probably speak to that more. In NATO, in the NATO members are also very worried. India, a country that the United States wants to improve its partnership with, there are lots of questions about U.S. commitment and resolve there as well. It doesn't mean that they will make a decision one way or another, but there is nervousness now. And on the moral side, we in this country value ourselves for our ethics, for our core values. Just consider the current state of Afghanistan. Young girls, teenage girls are not being allowed back into school. The Taliban are not letting them back. Today is the 35th, or perhaps the 36th day on which girls have not been allowed back to school. And now the UN estimates that by early next year, 97% of Afghan population would be living in poverty. The estimate for the poverty levels up until the US withdrawal was around 50%. And I think the administration has to own up to some of these outcomes that we're seeing.
Okay, Alex, grades, midterm, remember, midterm grades.
Midterm grade, yeah. I would say on cyber, I would give him a C+. He gets a C+ because he went to public school. If he was at Stanford, it would be a gentleman's A-.
Okay.
And I give him a C+, so it's not completely his fault. The cyber is, I think, one of the foreign policy areas in which we had extreme backsliding during the previous administration. The Trump administration actually started with a lot of promise in cyber with a very competent cybersecurity advisor who was acting very independently within the White House. And then when General McMaster was fired as the national security advisor, that cyber coordinator, Rob Joyce, was also fired. And then there was effectively nobody competent doing coordination for the rest of the Trump administration for the final 3 years. And we had a massive backslide. At the same time, the Trump administration was extremely aggressive with China on economic sanctions and great power competition, did a very poor job of defending against the Chinese asymmetric capabilities in the cyber sphere. And so Biden inherited a real mess here, but you have to, unfortunately, the last 12 months have been probably the most effective 12 months in the history of our field for America's adversaries. This started late last year, before the transition, before the Biden administration came in, with an intrusion by the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, one of the two successors to the KGB, an organization that Mike has run into, I'm sure, a couple times, the SVR, that successfully—
They're probably with us right now, Alex, because my phone's in my pocket, yes.
Yeah. The SVR successfully broke into 110 really critical organizations, including 10 American departments within the U.S. government through an attack by putting a backdoor in a product called SolarWinds Orion. That would be huge by itself, but while we were responding as a field to those 110 massive intrusions by the Russians, there were a series of vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange that were exploited by Chinese actors that broke into 80,000 American businesses and downloaded the email and the internal documents for 80,000 American businesses to then later be looked through and used for Chinese purposes. We've had massive successful attacks by ransomware groups. Ransomware has been a problem for years, but this year they've been able to disrupt our oil supply with the attacks against Colonial Pipeline. They've been able to, our meat supply with attacks against JBS, a massive meat processor. And a whole swath of American companies have been hit. And then quietly, you won't see in the newspaper, because these things, there's no disclosure laws around this, and companies usually cover it up, but those of us who work in the field are aware that a whole swath of semiconductor companies, aerospace companies that are being specifically targeted by the PRC as part of their China 2025 initiative and other kinds of initiatives by the Chinese government to make China independent of American supply chains, they have been successfully had all their intellectual property stolen. And so the Biden administration has been very reactive. They've done some smart things reactively. They finally have released the hounds on ransomware groups. Just yesterday, the largest ransomware group in Russia had all of their stuff turned off, which is probably an action by U.S. Cyber Command. And so there has been some smart reactions, but it's been highly reactive. And I think part of the core problem here is we still don't know who's in charge of cyber in the US government, right? There was nobody in charge in the Trump administration, and now there's like 5 people in charge under the Biden administration, and it's not clear who's driving it. Is it the National Security Council coordinator? Is it the new National Cyber Coordinator, a new position Congress created? Is it the director of CISA? Is it the director of NSA and Cyber Command? And there's no cabinet level secretary, and then all of those cyber people have to work with the China departments, the State Department and such. And so I would not say that we have a cyber strategy at all as a country right now. It's completely reactive, and we're just not going to win if all we're doing is reacting to the actions of our adversaries.
Well, as I always tell my students, the midterm is to know where you're at so you can get better for the final, right? So it sounds like the Biden administration has some work to do on all these issues. But I want to ask 2 more questions of everybody. Let's just go right through again, Marshall. I'll just start with you each time. I thought I was going to be more creative than that, but I'm not. You know, for effective policy prescription, you have to have accurate diagnoses of the problem, right? And tell us one thing about climate, or you can, well, whatever you want to talk about, but I'm guessing you're going to talk about climate. One diagnostic fact or theory that is not well understood by conventional wisdom, the Biden administration, or people at Stanford that is necessary to understand in order to develop effective policy prescriptions.
Great. Yeah. So the one I would point to, and you can see this, it's front and center in the media coverage right now of the climate discussions going on in Congress. It's really focused on the cost of action, right? What is the price tag on the Build Back Better plan or the infrastructure plan, right? And it's $3 trillion or $4 trillion, and you have Mitt Romney on camera telling us how long it would take to count to 4 trillion. It takes forever. It's such a big number, right? And just really focused on the cost of action, what it's going to cost to do something about climate change and related problems. And that's important. It will cost a lot, and these investments are absolutely expensive. I think what the debate ignores, and what the conventional wisdom ignores, is the cost of inaction, right? A reasonable person would compare the cost of doing something against what happens if we don't do anything, right? The cost of inaction. And this is a big problem I work on in my own research, and what we find is the cost of inaction is way larger, right? Tens or hundreds of trillions of dollars if we don't get this climate change problem under control, right? And those are impacts that happen here domestically, there are impacts that happen abroad. And so the cost of inaction absolutely dwarfs the cost of action, and yet we only see sort of one side of the puzzle. So I would love to see Biden out there more, and to his credit, he's done some of this, and also the media outlets really hammering the cost of inaction as much as the large price tags of the existing policy proposals.
I would, gladly count. I would gladly rather count to 4 trillion than 100 trillion. So that's what I would respond to Mitt Romney. So there have been, I think, there's been 30 years since the end of the Cold War, as of this December, and we've seen massive movements in the past 5 years or so, since 2017, all around the globe, demonstrating in favor of democracy, against authoritarianism, but also demonstrating in favor of a bunch of other things. First of all, there have been protests against the lifting of subsidies, protests against raising taxes or pension reform, like the Yellow Vest movement in France. There have also been different kinds of protests against corruption, and we've seen established democracies like Brazil and South Korea's leaders go to prison for corruption. So what we know is that people want and support democracy, but also that they feel there's something very broken about the relationship of democracy and capitalism today, 30 years after our colleague Frank Fukuyama declared the end of history. So President Biden has convened a democracy summit this December, when global democracies and activists and the private sector are going to come together and reiterate support for democracy. They're going to focus on 3 things: pushing back against authoritarianism, solving corruption or reducing corruption, and reiterating support for human rights, strengthening that support.
Very, very small agenda, right? Yeah.
Indeed, yes, and I think they're just going to talk about it for 2 days. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen, but what I will say is the conventional wisdom that democracy is good is great. There has been no rebuttal to that conventional wisdom. But I would push back against the idea that we can go back to some kind of democracy or consensus on democratic capitalism that worked really well in the past. You hear a lot about a golden age when, politicians just got along and we all just went to like little leagues and bowling alleys and democracy was great. Well, no, it wasn't great in that time. It excluded a lot of people. We've had a movement for Black lives. We've had a lot of labor activism just in the past week or two of people saying that their cut in globalization, the knowledge economy, whatever you want to call it, has not been fair compared to what it's been for other people. So moving forward, a global democratic agenda is going to need to address both democratic institutions and how well they work, and also issues of economic and racial justice in order to be successful.
Great answer. Ariana.
So the biggest conventional wisdom that is completely wrong about China is that China is trying to be like the United States, and it's going to be hard because nobody likes them, including their people. we have a lot of really simplistic ideas about autocracies. I can't tell you how many briefings. When I worked at the Pentagon for 9 years before I came out here, I was doing that as I was a professor at that time at Georgetown. And my generals would be like, can you give us a briefing about how if we fight a war over Taiwan, the Chinese people will like take to the streets in support of us? And I was like, I cannot give you that briefing because that's not gonna happen. So the first thing is, of course, people are upset with the turn towards authoritarianism in some aspects of Chinese society. There are pockets of totalitarianism, in particular in Xinjiang, but there is a lot of admiration, respect, and excitement among the Chinese people about what their country has accomplished. And their country has accomplished a lot in the past 25 years. So we're not dealing with a party that's worried that the Chinese people are going to overthrow them at any minute. And as much as we'd like to believe we're better partners in the world, there's a lot of countries that prefer to work with China than to work with us. So we think it's a messaging thing. Another rule of thumb I always have with the government is if we get back to we're just not having the right message, it usually means our policy is wrong. It's not the message. And then a big part of that, like I mentioned before, is the developing world. President Obama, I think, visited more African countries than any previous US president. I think it was around 11. Xi Jinping has visited 38. So they are very active, and they're trying to recruit, even with their space program. The United States, we like to say, look how powerful we are in space. China says to the world, we will let you come to space with us. You want to come to our space station? We will get you there. So they're providing these public goods to countries that don't have access to them. And so we can't compete by just running around the world telling everyone that we're better and that you should like us if we can't. And the last point is we're looking at all the wrong metrics in this competition. So the United States didn't build a colonial empire to compete with Great Britain, and China is not trying to build what we have. They're largely trying to differentiate themselves. And so I'm currently working on a book in which I look at this in foreign policy, military strategy, econ, tech, and it's amazing, like even in the military realm, I can Google very quickly, Chinese arms sales, Chinese joint exercises. How many joint exercises did they do with other countries? And I can find those data points because that's how the United States uses their military for power and influence around the world. But China sold in a 15-year period the amount of arms that President Trump offered in 1 year. They did the amount of joint exercises in a 10-year period that our 7th Fleet, so only our Navy assigned to the Pacific, did in the South China Sea in 1 year. This is not how they're trying to compete. But it is very hard for me to find metrics, and this is why, Mike, it's taken me so long to write this book. So you have to give me a break on that. But it's very hard to find metrics on their law enforcement training. Right? They want to be the internal security partner of choice. So they're going to countries and they're saying, I will train your police force. I will train your Coast Guard. I will give you this AI surveillance technology to help you deal with your population. That's how they're trying to build influence, not the way the United States does it. Until we wrap our heads around that, we're going to be constantly trying to outcompete China in areas where they're not even trying to compete.
Interesting. Sandhya.
Sure. So I identified two conventional wisdom which I think are hurting U.S. foreign policy. The first one is the idea that we have unlimited leeway when it comes to pivoting to countering these new threats that are emerging. I acknowledge them. The rise of China is certainly very concerning. Emerging technology, I think, has opened up a lot of avenues which are very troubling as well, and we need to do a lot more to counter these new threats that are emerging. But we don't have unconstrained leeway in pivoting away from things we have focused on in the past. And so, specifically fragility, state weakness in different parts of the Middle East, Africa, South Asia. I think those are major concerns and have implications for U.S. foreign policy. And I don't see that recognition. I see the current framing of the problem set as either or, and I think that can potentially hurt us. The second conventional wisdom that I see as being deeply problematic is I would say sort of the optimism that how the U.S. is somehow more resilient today to mass casualty terrorist attacks. And I think that kind of complacency can really hurt us. 9/11 was not only a tragedy in of itself, but it also unleashed a lot of bad pathologies in American domestic politics. And I feared that if there was to be another mass casualty attack, once again, we would see other similar terrible pathologies come into play, which can force the hand of political leader, whoever might be, could be Biden, could be the next president, into doing things that they may not exactly want to do, or things that may not be good for the country. And I think there is an underestimation of the vulnerability to mass casualty violence, especially by terrorist groups. Stop there.
Great. Alex.
Yeah, so I mean, my recommendation for administration now is to help refocus and build the government's capability on the defensive side. The US government has always been really good at offensive cybersecurity. We actually have the world's best hackers working for us. We have the world's best capabilities. We're not very good on the defensive side. And part of the problem is the relationship between the United States government and victims of cyber attacks is often very adversarial. Cyber is one of these weird places where foreign policy defense is outsourced to private organizations, right? Like if the People's Liberation Army Air Force flew over a bomber over us right now, or the Russian Air Force flew a bomber over us, that's the United States Air Force's problem. It's not Stanford's problem, right? Stanford does not have to run its own anti-aircraft systems. But if the Russian government breaks into Stanford's network, it is the responsibility of the Stanford CISO's office to do the defense. It's always going to be like that, but what happens now is that effectively, if you are the victim of a foreign policy decision, of a geopolitical decision by an American adversary, the US government is not there to help, it is there to punish you for that. Like that SolarWinds attack where 110 organizations were broken into is a real overall failure of American cybersecurity because there were 30,000 companies downloaded this poison chalice and drank from this poison chalice of this bad update. 30,000 companies had their computers reach out over the internet and talk to a Russian-controlled server at Amazon Web Services, and nobody noticed for 6 months. That is a huge societal level systemic failure. How is the United States government investigating this? Is the government interviewing these victims and trying to figure out what they could do better? Is it looking internal of why did we miss this? No. The Biden administration's SEC is sending threatening letters to the publicly traded companies that were affected to see whether or not they disclose this in their quarterly reports, as if like a paragraph of boilerplate in your 10K is going to keep the Russians out. It's idiotic. And so the Biden administration needs to reset this relationship of the US government is going to work with American companies to help defend, and if companies are attacked, that they need to come forward, and we're going to need congressional structure here around effectively a mechanism for companies to report these kinds of intrusions, and some legal and privacy shields and such. And there's been some proposals for that, and then the government can investigate what did we do wrong society-wise, and then try to fix it instead of trying to punish its way out of it, which is, we don't need any more hearings of senators yelling at CEOs. It's kind of useless. Congress has been doing that for 20 years. It's not getting better. What we need is kind of a real cooperation that doesn't exist right now.
Great answers, fantastic answers. So we have 6 minutes and 48 seconds left for the last question, and then I'm going to try to get as many questions in at the microphone. So begin thinking about your questions. But my last question is about, this is Stanford, right? This is Stanford reunion, so it's about Stanford. And it's about what you all think is our role in helping the Biden administration in terms of their foreign policy, or helping the world in terms of policy. And I say that because we all teach here at Stanford. Everybody up here teaches. Everybody up here does research. That's the core part of our mission statement at Stanford and at the Freeman Spogli Institute as well. But at FSI, and I would say at the university as a whole, Mark Tessier-Levine, our president, talks about this a lot, about a purposeful university and being part of solving these problems, not just analyzing them, not just diagnosing them, but being part of the prescription as well. And so I'm wondering, to stretch the metaphor that we started with, when somebody gets a low grade on the midterm in my classes, I see that partly as their fault, but I also see it partly as my fault. Like, if you're not getting this material, everybody at Stanford's smart. Never mind, no more Berkeley jokes. I was going to talk about C pluses and A minuses, but so what's our responsibility in terms of helping the Biden administration get from their kind of mid-level grades on the midterms to the final grades? And I say this, we just had here at Stanford yesterday the director of the CIA, Bill Burns. He spoke over at FSI. The week before, we had Secretary of State Tony Blinken was here and spoke to a group of our students. And in both of the sessions, by the way, just so you know, lots of fancy people come to Stanford. If they come to FSI, they're going to spend some time with students. And so both Blinken and Burns did special sessions just with students. None of you were invited. And in that place, they just beat that. We're being taped. They had very, very difficult questions. How's that for a diplomatic answer? To those two gentlemen. And at one point, they were like, well, what would you do? How could you help us in dealing with these problems? So my question, and it's now, I just burned up 3 minutes asking it. What do you think what should be the role of Stanford in terms of tackling the policy issues that you've all already diagnosed and given grades about? Marshall, to you.
Great, I'll be quick. Stanford has a remarkable opportunity to contribute on climate and sustainability issues. So last year, President Tessier-Levine announced Stanford's first new school in, I don't know, decades?
Decades, yes.
Since before I was born. Not that old, but it's been a while. And the new school is going to be focused on climate and sustainability, right? So this was announced a year ago. There's been a long planning process. It's still in development. But it's, for Stanford, a remarkable opportunity to really ramp up its contribution on teaching and on research in a way that contributes to the policy questions that we're talking about. I think right now, Stanford, to be honest, bats a little bit below its weight, to mix metaphors a bit, on climate and sustainability issues, and we can reverse that. And so I would encourage you to take every opportunity in coming months and years to get involved with that new effort. There are going to be many ways to get involved, but it's a really, really exciting opportunity to, again, start something new and start something really big at Stanford around climate and sustainability issues.
Great, Didi.
One thing I've loved about being at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at FSI is that we don't see ourselves as an academic department producing academic work. We do translational, synthetic work that brings the best findings in academia to big policy questions related to things like how you establish a stable democracy, how you get effective human development. And I think that that's the main way, is through really engaged research that tries to reach multiple audiences beyond the ivory tower. But two other ways are just personal engagement in communities that matter. Many of us are involved in civic groups or national policy groups that are aiming for some kind of reform or change. And this lets us be a little bit more normative or try to have an impact in our communities outside of the classroom. And finally, we educate. We have an honors program, an undergraduate honors program at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law that brings incredibly talented interdisciplinary undergraduates together every year to learn about these issues and write a thesis on this topic. And we're producing amazing next generation of scholars who are already elected into elected offices around the United States. They're working for the Peace Corps, they're in the private sector. And this is an amazing way that we can sort of seed these ideas in the next generation.
My son was in that program last year.
He was, a lot of Stanford
Dr.
kids.
Didi Kuo, and he had a fantastic time. Ariana.
So one of the hard things about thinking about what Stanford can do is that, I was an undergraduate here too. So the whole vision of what I think policy relevant research should be is exactly what Stanford does. And it's very rare that I've had to experience other places for short periods of time to see how unique this environment is. We create knowledge, and that, of course, is a core component of rigorous research. The reason I'm not at a think tank is I sort of felt like I would run out of stuff to say at a certain point. What I really have to do is the in-depth work to support the policy. But then supporting that policy takes more work. You can't just write an op-ed in the New York Times and then be like, okay, I've had my policy impact, right? So on Tuesday, I was in Colorado Springs talking to all the 4-stars and 3-stars of the Air Force, trying to convince them that all their views on China was wrong. The week before, I was at the White House and at the Pentagon, trying to actually influence the language that's going to go into our national defense strategy and our national security strategy. And of course, next month, I'll be on military duty for a couple weeks, planning the wars. Hopefully, we'll never have to fight. One of the great things about Stanford is, one, all my colleagues engage in this type of policy relevant work, and I can constantly reach out to them in collaborative ways to say, okay, I know about the China part, but can you tell me, you're a nuke expert, tell me why AUKUS is a problem from the proliferation point of view, because I don't really understand that. I always say it's better to look stupid in front of a few people and brilliant to the rest of the world than the other way around. And so that environment at Stanford, the collaboration, the multidisciplinary approach, and then the support that you have and the values that policy relevant research is what we should be doing, allows us, I think, even at junior levels like myself, to go out there and write our pieces and have our say and have the time to do the research to back it up so we feel confident then we make certain recommendations that might have a real impact on the direction of this country, that we did the best we could to make sure they were informative.
Great. Asfanjar.
Sure. Two things. I think first, Stanford has an important role to play in pushing scholars of foreign policy, international relations towards thinking about strategies, policies that improve international politics. International politics is deeply depressing. We've been discussing a lot of sort of mayhem around the world. A lot of conflict, constant conflict, and so analytically, there's a real tragedy unfolding all the time in international politics. And to the extent Stanford can train, compel its scholars, its research community to think about ways, specific dimensions in which we can make this world, international politics, more desirable, I think that's a very important contribution. The second major contribution Stanford can make, and this is something I've been involved with and have deeply appreciated, working with undergraduates, helping them sort of become more analytically minded. I worked with the CSAC Honors Program for 2 years, and it was the highlight of my academic career so far. You're seeing young students interested in foreign policy, wanting to join, contribute to public service. I think Stanford has already been doing a lot. Oriana is also a product of the Stanford CSAC Honors Program. I think we can do even more of that and push undergraduates towards public service.
Great, Alex.
Yeah.
Final word.
I'd like to see a big push to get our students more interested in public service. I mean, I think the research we do is incredible and fantastic. I'd love for us to make it a really easy on-ramp for students, especially like the MIP students, the students who come through FSI, a huge number of them.
That's the Masters in International Policy program at FSI. It's a 2-year master's program. Right. A lot of acronyms here, but.
Right, I'm sorry. So the masters that we have in our program, those students are, almost all of them go into government service at in many governments, right? Not just in the US government. But there's a lot of departments here that are world leading, I'm thinking especially in engineering and computer science, that do not have that on-ramp. Last summer, I sent 4 computer science undergrad or master's students who worked with me to work with DHS on election security. This was a huge pain in the ass, right? Because DHS did not have an internship program. We had to create it. We had to call HR. I had to call the director of CISA, and he had to create it. We actually had a lot
of acronyms there. Tell everybody those.
I'm sorry. I had to call the director of the cybersecurity agency in DHS, right? And he said, "That sounds great. Give me." He had come here. He gave a talk. He met these students. He's like, "I'd love to have them as interns," and it turned out to be really hard. We can't just offer our students up as like, come get them off a platter, because the people who are getting them off the platter is Apple and Facebook and Google, and the people who are going to pay them $175,000 starting salaries. Those students are not going to be naturally attracted to public service. And so I think those 4 students built the primary scanning system that scanned the election infrastructure for 10,000 election groups in the United States. So almost certainly the election infrastructure you used to vote last year was scanned by Stanford students, and vulnerabilities were found and mitigated by 4 Stanford students who revolutionized how DHS does election security. If we could get 100 Stanford students or 200 in, think about the impact it can have. But these students generally don't have, we have to push them into it. We have to tell them it's the right thing. And then we probably have to come up with economic incentives for them to do so. Like a lot of these students graduate $150,000, $200,000 in debt. This place isn't cheap. I don't know if you've noticed. All that landscaping costs some money. So like the students are paying $50,000 a year. The ones who aren't getting a lot of financial aid have a lot of debt. They're not going to be able to afford to service that debt on GS-8 salaries. And so I do think we need to build some kind of structure to push, especially the computer science students and the other students who have these huge starting offers to go work in public service. And then nobody asked me about this because I'm a fake professor, but like I think Stanford, from an educational perspective, should, over the next 20, 30 years, double the size of its undergraduate class. Like this year was less than 4% admission rate. I don't see that as something to be proud of. I see that as a failure, right? Like I think this university is basically empty. I don't know if you've seen, we got all this incredible space. Santa Clara County doesn't agree, but like we've got all this space. UCLA has 1/10 the campus with 5 times as many students. I think you could double the size of the undergraduate population and keep them as great, and that's something that I would love to see the university do, because I love the students I work with. I just want there to be more of them.
Well, thank you. Those were fantastic answers. I hope we are taping this and we will send it to the president and the provost. This
Right. And it's nice seeing you.
Yes.
Meeting you.
Good luck over at Berkeley.